Okay, welcome everyone. So today we're going to be going through a webinar that is probably on the more difficult end of the scale, at least when you start using words like cognitivism. However, I would recommend that you try and not think of these things as being too overly difficult. If you go online and you start looking up cognitivism or behaviorism or humanism or all these different things, these different terms and theories of learning and theories of acquiring knowledge and so forth, it can get really, really confusing. There's people spend their entire lives writing about these things. But I think it's important to really consider how does it help us as people who have to go into class tomorrow, take this bit of information and try and get that particular student to learn said bit of information or concept or skill or whatever it is. Now, whenever you go through anything to do with teaching strategies or even behaviour strategies, I always like to relate it back to the real world. A lot of the things you'll read online about cognitivism are not grounded in the real world, as in they're not written and developed by practicing teachers or teacher aides, literacy specialists, trainers or whatever. They're written about people who spend their lives writing about things. It's very important that you think about where that information is coming from, whether it makes sense to you and how you can apply it. Because regardless of how well they can structure a sentence, how big the words are they're using, if it doesn't make sense to you, then they're not a very good teacher and they haven't done a very good job, even if they sound intelligent. Now, cognitivism, very simply, I want you to think of it as meaning the way in which your brain works so that you learn stuff. Cognitive, the word cognitive just means of the mind or of learning. So if you just remember that, don't worry about the technical definitions and all the confusing stuff that you might read if you start Googling around or whatever. Just remember how it applies to us as professional educators is it's about how we learn and the processes and sequences and things like that behind that. And not so much how we learn, but also how the teaching and learning process happens. That happens in two real ways. Well, I wouldn't call it ways, but let's go with ways. It can either happen because one person is teaching another person, or it can happen because a student is teaching themselves. Now, there are obviously other approaches and beliefs about how learning happens and the social influences and how we can maybe construct knowledge and so on and so forth. I'm not to say that those are inappropriate for us as educators or that they're wrong or anything like that. I like to think again that all these different things, cognitivism, behaviorism, constructivism, these are different tools that we can use as educators to better deliver services to our clients and to better understand the way in which our clients may or may not learn. Now, cognitivism is one of those different isms that you'll come across in education. And for me, it's the one that I think is the most, I wouldn't say the most appropriate, but the one that I think makes the most amount of sense to me. Obviously, that's a very personal view, and there are different ones like constructivism, which is more modern, behaviorism, which is pretty much out of fashion now. That's kind of not considered to be trendy anymore. Cognitivism is still there. It's a bit more conservative in its approach, but I like it because of its simplicity. And I think if you were to learn about cognitivism, and I'll explain some of the main aspects of it now, and then later on you went on and started learning about constructivism, I think that would be a good process to follow, and then you can take the best of both and you can see how they gel together. I also think that teaching some subjects, some age groups, lend itself to being a more cognitivist type approach, and whereas others lend itself to be more of a constructivist type approach. They're probably the two main ones that if you were to look at the different isms, there's say 4 of them or so, it's really cognitivism and constructivism that you should be looking at. Constructivism is more so more so associated if you are working with really young students. I think those who consider themselves to be constructivists would probably argue that. In fact, I know they will, but it's more so used if you talk to teachers and they'll say, oh, I'm a constructivist teacher. They're generally the early childhood type teachers, because that's got a lot to do with play-based learning and tactile learning and things like that. Okay, so the basics of cognitivism, again, think of the word cognitive, think of cognitive learning, and just think of the mind, right? Now, oh, I don't know if you can read that. It's the first time I've used that one and it's already dead. I stole that one from another room. I want to use a different colour pen. I have to go black. Okay, so of the mind, just think of mind and how our minds think about information. So if you've seen any of my other videos, and I highly recommend that this probably isn't the first video that you watch, because it is probably a bit more complicated, but really cognitivism is something that we do as teachers all the time and covers the whole raft of different strategies that we use and that I talk about in a lot of those videos. So the explicit instruction, the modelling, the guided and shared learning, all these really traditional and common examples and ways of teaching have a lot of cognitivism embedded in them. In fact, as you'll see in a minute, a lot of them fall specifically into that cognitivist type approach. So what I'm trying to say here is that cognitivism is kind of like an umbrella under which all of these teaching type strategies that I talk about fall. So I do a few constructivist type things, but generally most of the strategies that I talk about come from or are embedded in some type of or aspect of constructivism as a broader umbrella term, I guess you could say. So when you're out there and you're going to PDs or you're listening to other educators and they talk about constructivism, just think about it being an ism that relates to the mind and how we learn things. I guess they're all related to the mind, but how we learn things, how information, and it's got a lot to do with information as well, and how information is observed, received, pushed into the brain type of thing, processed, stored, organised, and then how the reverse of that process happens to get it out of our brain so that we can then go and use it somehow and apply it or communicate with others and so on and so forth. So that is the best way that I can think of to explain cognitivism, and I'm trying to dumb it down as much as possible. So it makes it a little bit easier, because I don't want you to be scared of using that word and thinking, oh, it's, you know, just one of those real academic terms that mean nothing but everything. And in a way that's true. It does mean kind of, I don't want to say it means nothing but everything, but it's a big umbrella term that means lots of different stuff. Anyway, don't be too worried about cognitivism. I'm going to go through some bits and pieces about it now. So don't be worried about it in terms of it being complex or anything. Just think of it as meaning the basics of learning and the basics of what I like to think of cognitivism as being good old-fashioned, high-quality, best practice teaching. So that, again, is another way to think about it, that I think if some of the academics or psychologists or whatnot were watching this, they'd probably be tearing their hair out at my definition. But again, I like to take things and use it so that I can do it tomorrow. And that's the big thing. How can I use cognitivism tomorrow in a class with kids or in a class with adults? I don't like to think of things too much in that abstract sort of, or what the academics like to call epistemological perspective, or the, I guess, what the paradigm, or what my paradigm is, so what our viewpoint is. So these are just other, big ways that, big words that we can use to try and make ourselves sound more intelligent than we actually are. Anyway, so one of the first areas that I would like to point your attention to, or that you can see, if you've watched a lot of my other videos, you'll notice that a lot of these things here are actually already, I've actually already gone through and explained them and talked about them in the other strategies that I talk about. So down here we've got chunking, opportunities to respond, goal setting, feedback, formative assessment. I talk about the schema quite a bit. Match not examples I don't actually talk about. Modelling I talk about heaps. The word modelling is not really a cognitive thing. They call it something different, but it's still basically the same thing really. Linking existing knowledge, or which goes again by various different names. Bridging to prior knowledge and so on and so forth. So there's one aspect that I think we'll get started with though, and it's probably the more difficult part, because if you have seen my other videos, I haven't spoken about what is known as cognitive task analysis, but I do consider cognitive task analysis to pretty much be a metacognitive skill. Now, the word metacognitive basically means, or how I take it to mean and how I teach it and how I use it, how I write about it and whatnot, and plan it into lessons for students. Metacognitive skills means thinking about thinking. So, and there are, of course, if you want to get technical, there are cognitive skills and there's cognitive learning skills and so on and so forth. I don't bother with any of that mumbo jumbo. I just talk about metacognitive skills as a way that we, and what I think it means, or what I take it to mean, and how I use it in the practical world to teach people, as if I was teaching people tomorrow, is that I want them to be able to become self-directed learners. So all the teaching strategies that we use, planning sequences, chunking, whatever, goal setting, when you teach that to kids or adults or whatever, you're giving them a bunch of skills that they can go on to become self-directed learners. And that is, they are metacognitive skills. So they're all skills that we can teach people so that they can learn and think about thinking, so they can learn and approach things in different ways. They're all metacognitive skills. So that's a really important aspect of cognitivism. There is also you might have heard of a thing called cognitive task analysis. Now, again, if you don't remember this, I mean, who really cares? I use the word proceduralization a lot, which I don't actually think is a real word, but I use it anyway. But the two words that you will come across quite often is simplification and standardization. Now, I tend to not use those words. I use proceduralization because that's just what I used one day and I've just stuck with it. And it basically means that you're taking a task and you're dividing it down into little steps and making it as simple as possible to then be able to figure out what to do in different bits and what to do at different points in time. So if you've seen any of my videos, well, not any video, I don't talk about this every video, but like my one-on-one instruction one, for example, I talk about how you can diagnose and treat different aspects of a student's learning or their knowledge, where they might have problems in reading or writing and things like that. So if you had a maths problem, for example, and I won't repeat this because with this lecture here, I didn't want to spend 2 hours talking about cognitivism because I really have 60 videos talking about cognitivism, so just go watch those and just remember that they're all sort of under that banner anyway, most of them anyway, not all of them. So I'm just going to go through this quickly, but the example I commonly use, if you're teaching kids how to do a graph and you want them to be able to do a trend line, then that's say there's 5 or 6 different parts to that. Now you're just simplifying it and turning it into a procedure. So simplification, you say, well, that's easy, that's just a line. That's easy, that's just a line. I'm being a bit stupid here, but there are our dot points from our data points for the information that we've got based on the table or whatever. That's just the trend line. So we just kind of go, yeah, I reckon it kind of goes like that. We put a little bit of information there just to say what that line is, put a bit of information there to say what that line is, and then how would you explain that? Like if you had to explain that to a 6-year-old, let's say that it's, I don't know, speed with practice or whatever, so ignore that. But whatever the graph is, how would you explain that to a 6-year-old? So, and then the sentence you use to explain it is your interpretation, and that goes there. So you can see how I've taken something that if I said to you, I want you to go do a series of graphs that have a trend line and show over time the development of X, Y, Z. That's probably a pretty hard question. How would you get kids to do that? Well, cognitive task analysis means you take something, you take something and you simplify it you dumb it down and simplify it into a procedure. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's 7 different steps that we go through there. 8 if you really want to go a step before that and talk about dumbing it down really to the point of read the question over and over again, figure out what you know, what you don't know, all this kind of stuff. What do we have to make any assumptions and so forth? And I like to take it one step further and divide each of these into even more, I don't want to use the word stupid, but Really dumb it down as much as you possibly can. That's all cognitive task analysis means. You've got cognitive, which means you're dividing it down in your brain, how to do it in your brain. And then you've got task, because, well, that's a task. It's something we need to do. And then you're going to analyze it. So analyze just means you're looking at it and trying to figure out what to do, right? So that's cognitive task analysis. Again, don't think of that think of it like it's some big complicated thing and you start reading the Wikipedia pages on this and you'll go crazy. It's very, very simple. Dumb it down into steps. That's all it is. Chunk it down into steps. That's what chunking means. Okay, so, well, chunking actually means there's a few different versions of chunking, but one of them is to divide them into steps. So, and I like to also divide them down further. So you may get to the interpretation bit and you may decide, well, I'm going to divide that into an A, a B, and a C. Now, you've also done what I like to call proceduralization, because that means that then they can take that and they can then apply that to any other question that involves that. And in fact, you can see where the link is that they can do it not to that question, but now they can start doing those bar graphs where they're, well, this type of thing. Is that a bar graph? I asked this same question in one of the other videos I did. And they can do a bar graph. No, they can do a pie chart and stuff like this. So by proceduralizing it, they're able to not only do that one task. If you didn't proceduralize it and they don't get that deep learning, that deep contextual understanding, conceptual understanding of the purpose behind why things are happening and what it means and how it all flows and whatnot, they're not getting that deep understanding of the different parts of it. Then they're only getting surface learning, and they're only surface learning, which means they know something has to go there. They don't really know what it is. They're kind of guessing. They're just doing it, putting it in there because they did this example and they're kind of just copying it. They don't really understand the steps that well. Then they're not going to be able to take those concepts and apply them here and apply them there in a slightly different context. Or if you give them a question that has the bar thing go in a different direction, the trend go in a different direction, and so on and so forth. So, or if you provide information that's more tricky and that's more complex and it requires two as well as one that goes like that or something, it's just going to throw them out because they don't understand that procedure. If they do know that procedure because they've gone through a task analysis process, then they can apply that to even the most complicated aspects because they can go, well, 1's easy, 2's easy, 3's easy, 4's easy. I can't quite do number 5, but again, I can divide number 5. Realistically, there's 2 different lines there, so, well, I'm just doing number 5 twice. And they understand the concept behind it and the process behind it, then they'll be able to do that. And again, then they can take that, and they can develop that. Now, cognitive task analysis and being able to simplify it down, come up with some type of standard so that you've got a procedure, I just call that proceduralization, again, that's important for you to be able to do as the teacher, whether you're a teacher aide, literacy specialist, trainer, whatever, being able to divide tasks into little chunks and to analyse that task and to think, what exactly do you need to do to be able to do this? Because for adults, when we're developing and trying to teach kids, we quite often do those first 3 steps all together as an example because it's so easy that we just flow it all together. It's just like one flow. And that's what we aim for when students can do this. We want them to be able to just do it's a natural fluid sort of process, right? It's not a one, okay, what do I do next? Let's follow it. We want them to be able to go doot, 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 and just to be able to do it quite quickly and easily. Not necessarily quickly, but with a level of fluency that they don't need to, it's not a stock sort of do this, then do that. Yeah, you know what I mean. So now, point is, 1, you need to be able to do a cognitive task analysis so that you can teach it in steps. 2, you need to be able to teach kids how to do cognitive task analysis. You don't have to use these terms, but certainly then it becomes a metacognitive skill because they are thinking about thinking. They can go and study for exams. They can apply this kind of stuff. I wish I knew how to do this when I was, doing year 11 and 12 or at uni or whatever. They can do their assignments. If you ask them questions like, okay, I want you to go research nuclear power or something like that, then students know, okay, I'm going to go divide this into different steps. What do I need to be able to do to be able to research? First thing I need to do is to find the question. Second thing I need to do, third thing I need to do, so on and so forth. So they can come up with steps and they can come up with sub-steps, A, B, C, D within each one and plan that out. So that's a metacognitive skill. And you can see why that's important in the future. The kid wants to go off and learn about woodwork, computers, animals, dinosaurs, they get a part-time job doing something, whatever. Metacognitive skills are super important. Task analysis is super important, even if you don't call it cognitive task analysis, because that's where it starts to get confusing. And the same with cognitivism. As soon as you start using these type of terms, people run for the hills, they get scared and whatever. But it means very, very simple things. And I think those that teach this and those that write about it and devote their life to it, or to other things like constructivism or behaviourism, in which case they're usually anti-cognitivism, because again, they've devoted their career to studying it and proving that it's true, which is why you need to be very careful of reading research and things. Anyway, do us a disservice by teaching it in such an abstract and aloof way. Anyway, that's a different thing altogether. So just to continue with our metacognitive skills, I've actually got a whole video about metacognitive skills, and I talk about them a lot, so I won't go on here forever. But obviously mental planning, this is a type of mental planning. You're thinking through different ways of doing things. What different options do I have? Okay, this particular job is very difficult, or this task is hard. What are the 3 different options? What direction can we go here? Goal setting, watch my video on SMART goal setting, SMART. If you don't know what that is, then, well, I'm not going to say you should, you must watch that video because it's essential to anyone who works in the education sector. Formative assessment is really important as well. Not only providing formative assessment, but you want students to be able to do a form of formative assessment to themselves. So they've got that constant feedback loop as they're going through and doing something. They need to be able to provide themselves with feedback. They formatively assess where they're at. So formative assessment means informal assessment, really. You're looking at where you're at against your stated goals, or what you want to achieve with that particular activity. And you're thinking about and providing yourself with feedback, or you're doing this to students, but providing, as a metacognitive skill, they're doing it themselves, providing feedback to themselves about how they can use a different strategy to achieve their goal, or whether they're working in the right direction and need to stop and go do something different. So anyway, watch my metacognitive skills video if you want more information about that, because I am trying to get through this at a relatively fast pace. Formative assessment and feedback, I also have specific videos on that. And this goes to show as well that no matter what teaching strategy that we're talking about, we can always turn that teaching strategy into a metacognitive skill, and there are literally hundreds of teaching strategies. So if you're using teaching strategies or techniques or whatever to teach kids, then you should also be teaching them how to use that themselves so that they can become self-directed learners and they can use their learning time at home more effectively, and so on and so forth. So that's mental planning, goal setting, chunking, feedback, self-questioning. I did a video earlier about language and literacy, where I went through a lot of examples of self-questioning and how that fits into the language and literacy continuum, as I call it. Self-planning is very similar to mental planning. Well, it's the same thing, really. I guess self-planning is where you're actually sitting down and planning something out thoroughly. That's how I see that. Whereas mental planning, you're just sort of like, okay, what are my options here? How can I do this in a different way? Because quite often kids don't mentally plan. They don't go through that process. So it's important to teach them how to do that. And the example I always like to use is, if you have a tradie that comes around your house, say an electrician, they will generally, if you say, right, this is the problem, they will generally, and they do it very quickly because they're experts, think, okay, here are the 3 or 4 different options that it could be. Before I knock that wall down to see if that's the thing that's wrong with it, maybe there are some other things that we can do first. So we've got these different options. What's the one that's going to be easiest for us to do? So they're going through and doing these mental processes to problem solve and whatnot. So now summarising, synthesising, comparing, contrasting, outlining. These are all different ways of playing around with information, and again, different ways where you can add it to your brain, add it to your schema, your understanding of a certain concept. So that's another term that comes up quite a lot in cognitivism, and it's all about, schema is kind of, I guess you could think of it like the computer storage system that you have on your computer, the file storage system. That's sort of what the best way to explain schema. It's a file system in our brain, and we organise information in different ways, but not only just organise it in certain ways, but we've got ways of thinking about how, or understanding how things relate to each other. And I talk a lot about schema as in if you already know, let's say this is your file system in your brain, if you already know that much about something and someone comes along and there's that, you can easily just add that extra thing to that schema because it's just an extra rock in the pond, I guess you could say. Whereas if you only know two things, if I wanted to come and teach you something new or some new information came along, and it's a lot harder to add that when you already only know three things. So that's how I sort of think of that and explain what schema is. Because you've got such a comprehensive understanding here. There's so much you already know. And you can see that there's more of a chance that that might only tenuously link to these, one of these three. Whereas here, what are the chances of that piece of knowledge, that factoid or skill or whatever it is, what is the chances of that relating to that one, to that one, to that one, and so forth? So schema is all about that sort of file system in your brain and how that all organises. And it's also sort of thinking about, well, that one relates to that one, it relates to that one, it relates to that one, but and so on and so forth. So it's thinking about and having that, I guess, intuitive understanding of how things all come together. I won't bother picking that up because, yeah, you've got these that relate to there, but then you've got to think, okay, this bit of information relates to that one, relates to that one, relates to that one, relates to that one, and so on and so forth. So it's a bit of an abstract concept there, but I think that term is important. I don't really like to talk too much in abstract terms, but that particular term is important because you're thinking about the way in which information is organised in the brain. Now, this is where we come back to that linking to existing knowledge, because if you've already got all that information in there and you're thinking as a teacher or teacher aide about what students already have, bearing in mind that students always bring with them heaps of information. Watch my video on that as well, because I think that quite comprehensively covers that idea as far as why linking to existing information, or I think on that video, the term I like to use is building on existing knowledge, but people use other terms like prior knowledge and things, but it all means, basically all means the same thing. The idea that people come to us, they already know heaps of stuff. They never start from zero. It's a falsehood to think that. And most of the time when teachers are trained, teacher aides, trainers, they always make this false assumption that people know nothing. They know heaps. Even if they're coming in and they are completely wrong, it doesn't matter. That's still stuff here that makes it easy for you to build on. And that's where you should start, because starting at zero is practically impossible. Even if I know nothing about medicine, but even if I went into and started learning first year medical science or something, I don't know anything, but I have some idea. I've done a first aid course. I've been to the doctor before. So there's some information there that someone who knew about cognitivism and was using it, or just good teaching practice, would probably begin that lesson with, that day one. They would start with something. They go, right, well, you guys already know something and you already know how the hospital system works. You've probably been to hospital, and using that as a basis to begin. It makes students feel more comfortable and helps us achieve those learning goals early on in particular a lot easier and a lot faster. And then you can, again, just keep building and building on that. So that's how that linking to existing knowledge fits into the whole thing. That, again, planning sequences. So as you can see, I was basically talking about that as we were going through these different aspects here. Logical sequences that allow the brain to develop over a period of time. Cognitivism has a lot to do with space learning, which is another video that I've got, and something that originally when I first heard about space learning, I started talking about it and integrating it into what I did and what I do, I guess. I didn't really consider it to be that important, but the more I started talking about it and writing about it and thinking about it, the more I realised that space learning is actually it is very, very important. And I think it's something that all teachers, teacher aides, education specialists should understand. And in that video that I did on space learning, this is ridiculously simplistic, but talking about how information is transferred to long-term memory from short-term memory, where let's say you've got short-term memory or you've got long-term memory here. The basics of space learning as a theory is that so that's short-term and that's long-term. And in between here, you've got all those neurons and things, and you're constantly transferring information, which is another part of transfer, which is another terminology that you hear in this sort of area. So what that basically means is the information's going here and it's going back and so forth. Now with spaced learning, it means you learn something today, you come back, you've got to review it and practice it a couple of days later. So those pathways get stronger and stronger, stronger and stronger and stronger, generally speaking. And then they start connecting to each other, and then it becomes a lot easier to move that information across and a lot easier to create an extra one and so on and so forth. So that's where that sort of spaced learning comes to the fore in terms of this type of stuff. Although, if that doesn't make any sense, then go watch my spaced learning video, because it will make a lot more sense now that you've gone through and watched this. So what I take out of cognitivism is that what I like to think of cognitivism is almost like good old-fashioned traditional teaching. A lot of those aspects relate to cognitivism in my simplistic, broad, very generalistic type of view. It's not to say that some of the other different isms out there aren't bad or aren't that we can't learn from them, and I do use a lot of some of the other ones as well. This video is just on cognitivism, but a lot of the strategies I talk about and a lot of the strategies that make sense do come from or are embedded in a cognitivism type approach, and we can put a modern twist on it and use it in a way that helps students to reach their goals. And I like to say throughout all our videos that all of this stuff that we do, everything that educational research has been about, all these terms, all of them is focused around one thing, whether it's cognitivism, whether it's constructivism, all of it is around one thing. And that is how we, as teachers or educational professionals, teacher aides, whatever, can better serve our clients, help them learn better. And that, I think, is the central to everything. And when you think in those terms, and you think about how you can use these things to help students tomorrow, how you can practically put these things into place, then it becomes a lot more clear about what is useful and what's not. So if you're going through and doing some research and learning about cognitivism, particularly reading things online, be prepared for the fact that you're going to be a little bit confused. And again, just dumb it down. So do something of a cognitive task analysis and simplify it so that it makes sense. Think about how you can use it tomorrow. What can you learn about this particular strategy so you can use tomorrow? Even if you're watching my other videos, there might be aspects of it that, well, there'll be parts of it that you disagree with, or that you can't use, or it doesn't make sense to you now, or whatever, or that you think is just stupid. So chuck it out, don't use it. Keep it there just in case in the back of your mind. Maybe it might be useful later on, or you can adapt it and change it and do it in a different way, but always just use it in your own sort of way. Now, just on a last point, how I use cognitivism, or probably the number one way that I use cognitivism, is really around this metacognitive skills area. So for me, I see that there are two different ways that I use cognitivism, I guess. One is this metacognitive area, which is teaching kids how to learn by teaching them the teaching strategies that we're supposed to be using, or that is best practice, according to me anyway. And two is those teaching strategies that are good old-fashioned, or what I like to consider to be good old-fashioned teaching. So, using instructional models, illustrations, metaphors, analogies, demonstrations, which really feeds into a lot of the basic tenets of how we structure out lessons and things. So that is my take on constructivism. I hope that makes sense and at least gives you a doorway into this new topic, so that you can begin to use some of these new terms and be able to implement them in the real world. So that's cognitivism.